Max, a 12-year-old boy, stood in front of the old, slightly worn-down animal shelter on the outskirts of the small town of Linfield. The building looked as if it had seen better days. Its faded blue paint peeling from the wooden walls and a rusted metal sign hanging above the entrance, swinging slightly in the wind. The air carried the scent of damp earth and hay, mixed with the faint smell of animals. Max hesitated for a moment, adjusting the strap of his backpack on his shoulder before pushing the heavy wooden door open. Inside, the shelter was quiet except for the occasional barking and rustling of animals in their cages. The air was warm and filled with a musky scent of fur. Rows of metal enclosures lined the walls, each one housing a different animal, some curled up in the corners, others pressing their noses against the bars, hopeful for attention. Max had never been to a place like this before. He had always wanted a dog, but his family had never stayed in one place long enough to make it possible. Since moving to Linfield with his mother, Max had struggled to find his place. He wasn't exactly shy, but making new friends had never come easily to him. The kids at school were polite, but distant. He often ate lunch alone and spent his afternoons wandering the quiet streets of town, feeling like an outsider looking in. But he had always loved animals. He had read once that dogs could be a person's best friend, and right now that was exactly what he needed. As he walked past the kennels, he glanced at the different dogs inside. Some were young and energetic, bouncing up against the doors, barking excitedly. Others were older, calmer, their eyes watching him with quiet curiosity. Then in the farthest corner of the room, he saw him. The dog was medium-sized with a thick, slightly unkempt coat of black and white fur. Age had started to show in the gray patches around his muzzle, and his dark brown eyes carried a deep sadness. Unlike the others, he did not jump or bark. Instead, he simply sat there, gazing at Max with a quiet, knowing expression. Max crouched down, resting his hands on his knees as he looked through the metal bars. The dog lifted his head slightly, his ears perking up just a little. After a moment, he slowly got to his feet and walked toward Max, his movements slow but steady. He pressed his nose against the bars, sniffing the boy's fingers, before giving them a small, hesitant lick. A warmth spread through Max's chest. There was something about this dog, something different. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't begging for attention. He was simply there, waiting. And Max, in that moment, knew that he had found his dog. "His name is Ben," a voice said behind him. Max turned to see a woman in a green shelter uniform approaching. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and a clipboard tucked under her arm. "He's been here for a few months," she continued. "Someone found him wandering near the highway. No collar, no microchip. We think he must have had a family once, but no one ever came to claim him." Max looked back at Ben, who was still watching him silently, his tail giving a slow, hopeful wag. "Why hasn't anyone adopted him?" Max asked. The woman sighed. "Most people want puppies or younger dogs. Ben's older, and he's not as playful as the others, but he's one of the sweetest dogs we have." Max didn't hesitate. "I want to take him home." His mother wasn't thrilled about the idea at first. They lived in a small house, and taking care of an older dog would be a responsibility. But after seeing the way Max looked at Ben, and the way Ben quietly leaned against him as if he had already chosen him, she agreed. That evening, Max walked home with his new companion by his side. The leash felt light in his hand, and with each step, a sense of excitement and belonging grew inside him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. Life with Ben quickly became an adventure. The old dog was calm and gentle, but he had a quiet strength about him. He didn't demand attention, but he was always there, watching, listening, offering comfort in his own way. Max quickly realized that Ben was not like the other dogs he had seen in the shelter. He didn't bark much, and he wasn't interested in chasing balls or fetching sticks. Instead, he liked to follow Max wherever he went, his steady presence a constant reassurance. Every morning, Ben would walk with Max to school, waiting patiently outside the gate until he returned. The other kids started to notice. At first, they would just glance at Ben as they passed, but soon some of them began stopping to pet him. A few of the boys from Max's class even asked about him, curious about his story. Slowly, the walls that had separated Max from his classmates began to break down. But Ben wasn't just a bridge between Max and the other kids. He was also his protector. One afternoon, as Max walked home alone, a group of older boys from school blocked his path. They weren't exactly bullies, but they were bigger and louder, and Max felt his stomach tighten as they laughed and shoved each other, looking his way. Before Max could react, Ben stepped forward, placing himself between Max and the boys. He didn't growl or bark, he simply stood there, tall and unmoving. His presence alone was enough. The boys hesitated, then backed off, muttering something before walking away. Max looked down at Ben, his heart pounding. "Thanks, buddy," he murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. Ben just wagged his tail. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. One evening, as Max and Ben were walking home, Ben suddenly stopped and let out a sharp bark. His ears perked up and he pulled on the leash, leading Max toward a small alleyway between two buildings. Curious, Max followed. At the end of the alley, curled up against the cold stone wall, was a tiny, trembling puppy. Its fur was matted, and its eyes were wide with fear. Max knelt down, reaching out a hand. The puppy flinched but didn't run. Instead, it let out a tiny, pitiful whimper. Ben stepped forward and, to Max's surprise, gave the puppy a gentle nudge with his nose. The puppy hesitated, then sniffed Ben in return, seeming to take comfort in the older dog's presence. Max knew he couldn't leave the puppy there. He scooped it up carefully, feeling how light and fragile it was in his arms. "We'll take care of you," he whispered. When they got home, Max's mother sighed but didn't argue. She knew by now that Max had a heart too big to turn away an animal in need. And so, just like that, their little family grew by one more. Ben had once been alone, just like Max. Now neither of them were alone anymore. As the weeks passed, Max and Ben settled into their routine. They had become inseparable, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. But life, as Max was learning, was never without its challenges. One morning, as Max walked out of the house, he noticed Ben moving slower than usual. The dog stretched, his joints creaking slightly as he stood. It was the first time Max truly noticed Ben's age. He wasn't a puppy, he was an older dog, and older dogs had their struggles. At school, Max found himself distracted. He kept thinking about Ben, wondering if he was okay, if he needed something more. He had always assumed that love was enough, but now he realized that caring for an older dog meant understanding its needs, recognizing its limitations. That evening, he and his mother took Ben to the local vet. Dr. Harris, the town veterinarian, was a kind older man with a gentle touch. He examined Ben thoroughly, nodding to himself as he checked the dog's joints and heartbeat. "He's doing well for his age," he said, "but he's not as young as he used to be. You'll need to make some adjustments. Gentler walks, a special diet, maybe some supplements for his joints." Max listened carefully, taking in every word. He had always seen Ben as strong, invincible. Now he understood that loving him meant adapting to his needs, making sure he was comfortable and happy in his later years. Back home, Max made changes. He adjusted their walks, making them shorter but more frequent. He convinced his mother to buy the special food doctor Harris recommended, even though it was more expensive. And at night, when Ben's legs seemed stiff, Max would sit beside him, gently massaging his joints the way the vet had shown him. Despite the changes, Ben never lost his spirit. He still wagged his tail when Max came home from school, still watched over him with those deep, knowing eyes. And Max, in turn, learned patience, responsibility, and what it truly meant to care for someone. But not all challenges came from Ben's aging body. One evening, as they walked through town, Max noticed a flyer posted outside a grocery store. It had a picture of a dog, a black and white one, with a familiar-looking face. The words above it sent a chill through his chest. "Missing family dog. Answers to Ben. Reward offered." Max stared at the paper, his heart pounding. The name, the face, it was too similar to be a coincidence. He looked down at Ben, who stood beside him, tail wagging slightly, unaware of the storm raging inside Max's mind. Had Ben belonged to someone else before him? Had a family been searching for him all this time? Max took a deep breath, gripping the leash tighter. He had a choice to make, one that could change everything. Max stood frozen in front of the flyer, his heart racing. The words printed in bold ink sent a wave of emotions crashing over him. He looked at Ben, who wagged his tail slightly, his dark eyes filled with trust and contentment. Could he really belong to someone else? Had Max unknowingly taken a piece of another family's heart? That night, Max barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning with questions. He couldn't imagine life without Ben, but he also couldn't ignore the possibility that someone else had once loved him just as much. The next morning, he made up his mind. He took a deep breath and called the number on the flyer. A woman answered. Her voice trembled as she confirmed that she had lost a dog named Ben months ago. He ran off one evening and never came back, she said. We searched everywhere, put up flyers, but after a while we thought he was gone for good. Max's throat tightened. He looked at Ben, who lay beside him, head resting on his lap, breathing deeply. He felt a lump form in his chest. I have him, he said quietly. There was silence on the other end, then a choked sob. You do? They agreed to meet the next afternoon at the park. Max spent the whole day dreading it. Every step toward the park felt heavier than the last. What if Ben ran straight to her? What if he wagged his tail and forgot all about Max? When they arrived, a woman and her teenage son stood waiting near a wooden bench. The woman clutched a leash in her hands, her knuckles white. When she saw Ben, she gasped. Ben? She whispered. Ben looked up, ears perked. He hesitated, then took a step forward. Max's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment he feared. But then Ben stopped. He turned his head, looking back at Max. His tail wagged, but he didn't run to them. Instead, he stepped closer to Max, pressing his head against the boy's side. The woman covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. He remembers us, she murmured. But she met Max's gaze, seeing the pain in his eyes, the way his fingers curled into Ben's fur. And then she seemed to understand. The teenage boy spoke. Ben chose you, he said simply. Didn't he? Max nodded, unable to trust his voice. He looked at Ben, feeling a bond stronger than words. He had loved this dog, cared for him, given him a new life, and Ben had made his choice. The woman knelt down, rubbing Ben's fur gently. I'm just glad he's safe, she whispered. Then she smiled at Max. You take good care of him, okay? Max nodded again, his heart pounding with relief and gratitude. As they walked home, Ben trotted beside him, tail wagging like it always did. Max reached down, running a hand through his fur, feeling the warmth of their bond. He had feared losing Ben, but now he knew. Some friendships were meant to last forever, and no matter what, Ben would always be his best friend.